Hello everyone and welcome to this UnaTerra hosted webinar on hiring trends in 2023. For those who don't know me, my name is David Wall and I am the CEO of UnaTerra. I'll be chairing this panel discussion today and I'm delighted to be joined by two individuals who are operating on the front line when it comes to this important topic. Please allow me to introduce Ben Davies from Erevena and Mel Crate from Luminate. Welcome, Ben and Mel.
Thank you so much, David.
Hey, David. Thank you very much.
Ben, Melby, thank you for taking the time to join us today and talk to us. Perhaps before we start, could each of you just provide a short overview of yourselves and your organisations?
Mel, would you like to go first?
I'll let you kick off.
Okay, so hey folks, Ben Davies, I'm a partner in Erevena. Erevena is a London headquartered exec search firm. We operate exclusively in the tech space. We have offices in the UK, in Sweden, in Denmark, in Paris, New York and San Francisco. And we almost exclusively work with investor-backed tech companies of all shapes and sizes, delivering leadership mandates across areas like go-to-market, product, engineering, and operations.
Great, thanks, Ben.
And I'm Mel Crate. As David said, I'm the founding director of Luminate. We're a wellbeing consultancy and we partner with organisations internationally to help them develop their wellbeing strategies and deliver impactful wellbeing programs. I set up the company around 7 years ago now after my own experience of mental illness and how that was supported in the workplace. So Luminate aims that every employee has a better experience than I did, and to create that both from the employee side and also from the employer side to make sure that each employee is supported in that journey.
Great, thanks, Mel. Okay, so before we launch into the conversation, I just wanted to also say thank you to everyone that has taken the time to dial in. It's a busy time of year for most folk, and I can see from the registrants list that we have people dialing in from all over the globe. So good morning to those people that have joined on the West Coast. Good afternoon to those people on the East Coast, and good evening for those people that are either in the UK, mainland Europe, or even later into the evening as we go further east. This session will be recorded and obviously be made available to everybody. And you'll also have the opportunity to post questions as well. So please feel free to put them into the channel. So the plan for the session is to talk for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll take some questions at the end. Given the nature of the topics, I think we could easily fill 2 hours. So we're not planning to do that. You'll be pleased to know. But if we don't necessarily go too deep into some of the topic areas, then we can, of course, arrange some dedicated sessions in the new year. Okay, so let's set the scene or provide some context as to why this topic is so relevant. So certainly as the CEO of UnaTerra, we work with 300 or so fast growth companies currently, all with international operations. And we're talking to them day in, day out about, the challenges around growing their businesses and, hiring people, retaining people. And it's a day in, day out conversation for us. We also see it in our own business because, when I think about looking back over the last 12 months, and all of the challenges that everybody else has experienced, the coming out of the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the cost of living, and the wider inflationary pressures that everybody is being affected by, we've not been immune to it. I suppose from my perspective as a CEO, though, what I have seen is continued growth in our business, strong sales growth, but who knows what 2023 will hold? And that's really the primary purpose of this conversation today. So a recent survey of UK businesses found that hiring intentions over the past year are an 8-year high. But a whopping 86% of employers have experienced skills shortages. Within the same survey, US headquartered businesses found that 42% of employers are losing talent to higher paid offers elsewhere. And this is the challenge that we see in our own business and, you know, is a real hot topic today. So in summary from my seat as the chair of this panel today, we're certainly seeing a strong appetite from businesses to continue to scale and grow internationally. But at the same time, it has become increasingly difficult to recruit and retain world-class talent. So Ben and Mel, I'm going to stop talking now, and I'm going to turn or invite your comments around what you've seen have been the biggest challenges over the last year and what you're expecting to see in 2023. And perhaps, Ben, given that you're in slightly earlier on in the you know the cycle, so you're in the recruiting phase.
Yeah,
I'd like to pose the question to you first, if I may.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, David. Look, I think it's been a really interesting year this year. I think it's very much been a kind of tale of two halves. Certainly from an EMEA perspective, I think, you know, the US may have seen things see the downturn a little bit earlier than we did here in EMEA. But I think from our perspective, you know, if I look at the first 6 months of this year, you know, the market over here was still incredibly buoyant. There was still a really healthy supply of investment fueling disruption and the growth, especially high growth tech companies and companies outside of tech. And then if we kind of look at this from a supply and demand kind of perspective, there was a huge demand for talent, tons of opportunity, job opportunities, but very few candidates, you know, in supply. And I guess over the last 6 months, we've seen that kind of gradually flip round. And I think to your point earlier, David, you know, driven by macroeconomic factors such as inflation, rising interest rates, and then other variables like a looming recession, the Ukrainian war. You know, this has just resulted, understandably, in businesses becoming more cautious, and therefore demand for talent has reduced a bit. But I would say on the flip side, the supply of candidates actively looking and passively looking has changed considerably. Now, you know, why has that happened, I guess, is the answer. And I think one of the things that we can point to, you know, is there's been a huge downward trend since the start of this year in terms of the valuation of companies, especially tech company valuations have dropped exponentially since the start of this year. And this has also had a massive knock-on effect to the value of their employees' stock options. So kind of, if I look at conversations I've had with candidates over the last kind of, you know, 5 to 6 months, just very simply the value of their stock options is 4 to 5x less than it was at the turn of this year. And that just simply means that candidates aren't as vested in the current trajectory they're in and are more willing to have a look at the market, in parallel with the fact that organisations have reduced cost, you know, cut costs and reduced headcount and, you know, shed maybe 10-20% of their workforce in some instances. So suddenly the supply of talent has increased, yeah, quite dramatically, and the demand for talent has dropped.
Yeah.
Now, I think what I would say is we're still really cautiously optimistic about next year. You know, speaking to leaders out in the market, I think a lot of people are looking at Q4 in terms of calendar year Q4, so ending in December this year. A lot of leaders are looking at performance for the business this year to base their planning assumptions on next year. And I think, you know, most of the people we're talking to, you know, are pretty bullish about Q4 and the results. So I think here we're cautiously optimistic. that there's going to be significant demand for talent next year, but there will also be a significant supply of talent as well next year in terms of candidates.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Ben. Mel, if we could kind of look at the retention side now, same question to you. Do you want me to repeat the question, or can you remember it?
Yeah, it'll be great if you could repeat the question. Thanks, David.
So if we were talking about the, just a bit of commentary about what you've seen around the biggest challenges to retaining top talent in the last year and what you're expected to see in 2023.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. It's, I think, been a really interesting time. I think COVID kind of turned, and the pandemic turned everything on its head. And I'm sure we've all heard of the great resignation that started, I think, at that time, and I think has continued to a degree. People are, I think, interesting what Ben was saying, and I think there's a lot of up and down, but people have been describing it as an employees market. And I think employees have a much higher expectation from the places that they work now than they used to. It's not just a simple exchange. I'll take the money, I'll deliver the work. I think they do want a lot more fulfillment. They want good working conditions. They want work-life balance. And those are all things that weren't necessarily something that were offered frequently by employers, and wellbeing is obviously becoming much more of a focus for people now. And I think we've definitely seen that shift with the younger generations coming into the workplace. And I think if employees aren't able to find that sense of balance, that sense of well-being, that fulfillment, purpose in their work, I think they will look elsewhere. And so I think employees have got to do a lot of work on how they create an impactful well-being strategy, how they help their employees feel the purpose of what they're doing, how they get everybody bought into those common goals. And I think that's going to be a challenge for a lot of organizations. And I think that's really the key to retaining good talent. But I think what we've seen, flexibility is so important. That comes up on the top of all of the surveys when employees are asked what's important to them at work and what would help them improve their well-being. And there were companies before COVID that were offering a great level of flexibility, remote working, just a better balance for people. And I think that's an expectation now rather than a nice to have.
Ben, just perhaps coming back to you on what Mel's outlined. You're at the front end of the cycle in terms of talking to candidates. Is that consistent with what you're seeing in terms of perhaps 5 years ago it was all about salary and what stock options they were getting, versus what's the conversation like today in terms of what candidates are looking for?
Yeah, I think that things have shifted greatly in the last 5 years. I think driven by Gen Z and millennials, kind of the expectation now around what an employee is looking from an employer has shifted greatly. And I think it's no longer about the employer interviewing the employee, as it used to be. It is also now very much about the employee interviewing the employer. So making sure that you've got things like your employee brand, absolutely on point. Making sure that the candidate experience is world class. From the point that you engage with a candidate to the point that you offer that candidate and onboard that candidate, and the components that make up the package to entice that candidate to join. All of that has to feel like an incredible experience and be on point, or candidates will choose another company that has got all of that stuff right.
And I think, I mean, Ben, you'll know more about this than I do, but even just having a look at kind of job specs out there, there's much more listed now around those points, flexible working, remote working options, wellbeing initiatives, wellbeing benefits that are offered, parental leave benefits as well. I think all of that is much more visible on a job spec, again, as a way to kind of entice good talent. And I think, again, to meet the expectation of what employees want nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Ben, if I can just touch on a survey that Erevena did recently, which I saw. So I think this looked at kind of exec and VP level salaries.
Yeah.
And if we just focus on the European market for a moment, were there any key learnings from that survey that Erevena sort of put together during that exercise?
Yeah, there were some really interesting outcomes from that. So I think we're probably all aware that average compensation levels have been rising for a number of years. But I would say probably over the last few months, this has started to stabilise and plateau a little bit. I would say that candidates are becoming a bit more realistic in terms of compensation versus maybe 6 to 9 months ago. I think one really interesting dynamic that came out of the salary survey is that we found that the gap between VP and C-level compensation has closed quite considerably. Now, I would put this down in part to what I call title inflation. So by that, I mean, with this explosion in early stage tech companies across Europe, they're probably more willing to give out a C-level title to a VP level person to entice them to join their company.
Okay.
So that's probably skewed the data a little bit. And then I think probably the other thing that I would point to is that there's been, because of this dramatic growth in investor-backed tech companies in Europe, it's led to this increased demand for VPs to lead the growth of the business from low-digit millions to double-digit millions. And look, these folks are in short supply. So, you know, if you think of a founder and the skill set they have in terms of founding that business, they're desperate to hire those individuals that can plug the skills gap that they don't have in order to take them from 0, 1 million to 10 to 12 million. And it just means that the price of those individuals across areas like sales, marketing, product, engineering, tech, it's just driven the price of a VP's compensation up quite dramatically. So that's kind of a really interesting focus that we've seen in terms of that gap closed between VP and C-level.
When you say quite dramatically, Ben, I might be putting you on the spot here, but is percentage-wise, is there a range?
I mean, I don't know percentage-wise, but we're probably talking 20-30%, something like that.
Okay, so sizable.
So significant.
Yeah. Question for both of you. So, are you seeing any key trends in what employers and employees are looking for in a new hire or role? So, I'm thinking specifically, so the work we do at UnaTerra is, hiring international employees, and a lot of the conversation or narrative, which I'm sure we've all seen, is around hybrid working, remote working, things like that. I'd just be interested to get your perspective on, any key trends that you're seeing around, employers and employees and what they're looking for in a new hire.
So I think from an employee perspective, I'd say looking at, obviously well-being being important, but I think they're looking for more inclusive workplaces as well, and for companies to be doing that in a meaningful way. And I think that can look like lots of different things, but I think it's policies that are actually lived day to day in the company and supported by senior management at all levels, which I think is something that still needs a lot of work in a lot of organizations. But those things are important. And by inclusive policies, it's obviously looking at things like DEI. Lots of the companies that we work with are developing things, policies around mental health and well-being, but also policies around the menopause, for example, gender inclusivity. There's lots happening in that space too, to make sure that everybody in the organization feels included and able to continue work. And we've seen another trend, the kind of unretirement, this idea that a slightly older workforce are returning to work largely because of cost of living rising, pension not meeting cost of living now. And so I think workplaces have to, again, do a lot of work to make sure that they are inclusive and that they are meeting the needs of employees at every level from every demographic. And again, I think there's definitely work to do, but again, I think that's an expectation from employees that should be in place now. And that also feeds into things like parental leave policies. So we've seen some big companies, I think it was JP Morgan recently, who announced, I think it was 16 weeks of full pay for new parents, regardless of whether you're the main caregiver or not. So for both mothers and fathers, which I think is groundbreaking and brilliant. And I think the way that companies will shift, because when we talk about gender inclusivity, I don't think we often think about parental leave policies for the fathers, but that plays a big part in it. It's moving away from the idea that bringing up children is women's work and trying to plug that gap where women have those longer career breaks, less long-term career opportunities. Women are the ones to go back part-time, again, missing out on career development. And so I think there's the idea that companies should be thinking about that from all angles and actually making meaningful changes to improve things in the workplace. And again, I think that continues to be an expectation and giving it more than lip service, which I think companies have been speaking about D&I for a while, but what's actually tangibly happening to make sure that is improving in organizations to make sure they can retain and attract and retain the top talent.
It's a really interesting expression that you use, though, the employee expectation, because it really feels like, certainly as CEO of a business, that the focus, whilst I think it's very much still a balance. The employers have lots of choice out in the market. The employees really do scrutinize now, the type of environment that they're going into. And
I think it has to be seen. Yeah, I think it has to be seen as a mutual contract. It shouldn't be weighted one side or the other. Obviously, as an employer, you need that person to carry out their role, their duties. But as an employee, there's more you expect for that than just your paycheck at the end of the month. And I think you're right. It's definitely, I think it's something that Ben mentioned earlier, is it's a kind of interview on both sides. It's not just simply, are you the person we want to fill this role? It's from their perspective, is this an organization I want to be a part of? And that I would be proud to work for. And I think that's something that's, really interesting. That's definitely changed in recent years.
Good. I'm just looking to see whether we've got any questions from our audience at the moment. There's one here around what are businesses and employers doing, and what should they be looking to do to be more attractive and to retain their talent? So it's kind of, and then it's closed off with any top tips. So I don't know whether you've got any top tips for the audience.
I realise I've spoken quite a lot. Ben, do you want to jump in, or I've got some ideas?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, Mel, you articulated far better than I can a lot of this stuff. I'll push it back to you.
Great. So I think employee wellbeing is not new anymore. I think it's been around now for quite a few years. And again, I think in order for companies to really get ahead here, we have organizations saying to us all the time, well, what should we be doing, or what should we be doing next? We've done X, Y, and Z. We've run some wellbeing workshops. We've done mental health first aider training. We've trained our managers to be able to have conversations around mental health. But what actually comes next? What should we be looking at? And actually, I think it's, rather than continually thinking about, okay, what new innovative types of activities can we be doing, I actually think it needs a much more strategic approach. And I think that's really lacking. And in some of the enterprise level clients we work with, we're seeing that reflected in those conversations of how can we actually make sure that what we're doing is measured, and that it's making a difference, and that it's supported at all levels of the organization. So that requires leadership buy-in. It requires everybody in the organization to be on board with that wellbeing strategy, but also to think about okay, you run the training, but what comes next? How do you make sure that it's lived day to day? It has to be a whole strategic approach. And I think that's going to be what employees want to see, because that's what will make an actual difference to their well-being. And there is sometimes a slight tension between the idea of expecting high performance as an organization and trying to make sure we're taking care of people's well-being and mental health, that we're not causing them to burn out or experience health issues because of work. And I think that's something that companies will definitely have to address in the coming years, as responsibilities outside grow in terms of caring responsibilities and other things that people have to spend time on now. So I think employers have to be even more careful there. I think in terms of kind of well-being, I think it has to be a strategic approach of thinking about, okay, we've trained this group of mental health first aiders, but what next? We let them loose out there into the organization, but how do we know, is anybody talking to them? Are they able to carry out their role effectively? What challenges are they facing? Is there a space for them to be able to discuss that, to develop in the role and to be supported in that? And I think it's those kind of things where everything is tied together. There's a reason for doing everything, and it fits into a wider organizational strategy that is also tied to business performance, because we know that an investment in this area gives a strong ROI.
Yeah, great.
I think, David, just to jump in on top of that, as well as that, I think from a kind of recruiter perspective, it's that kind of ongoing development, ongoing education, within a business. So if you are, as an employee, constantly challenged, being developed, being rewarded, happy, you're not going to leave that company. But if any of those components break, there's push factors to make those individuals start to think about where can they be more fulfilled.
Yeah. So I'm conscious that we're running up against the deadline or a hard stop. But Ben, just if you think about 2023, and people who are listening to this, is salary the most important thing that candidates are still looking for? Is it remote working? What are you seeing? Admittedly, it's kind of tech businesses that you're working with at the moment. I'd be interested to get your view, or is it a much more balanced approach now in terms of candidates?
You have to look at these things holistically. It's not about one thing anymore. It used to be very much kind of salary and development focus within a business. I think if you haven't got every kind of component part right, you're going to struggle to hire people. So people want great salaries. Clearly, there's a normalization of remote work now and digital technologies that enable people to work remotely very effectively. You need to have your D&I in place. You have to have your wellness in place. You've got to look at this holistically and have everything right in order to attract the best talent.
Great. We've got a question. If we can just run on for 5 more minutes, Ben and Mel, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. And hopefully the attendees are all right. So just trying to find the question here. It's just moved up on the screen. So we've got high performance culture is bandied around a lot in SaaS-based companies. Sometimes it's used as an excuse to push people beyond what is appropriate. How can companies create a high performance culture without running their employees into the ground? Mm-hmm. I guess that's directed at you, Mel.
Yeah, it's a tough one, and we see it all the time. I was recently with a tech company, fast growing. They're only about 30 employees. But all of their employees were in their 20s, and none of them had children, and they were all working 12, 13-hour days. I was like, this is all great, but once your employees start to hit that age where they then have, some of them will go on to have families, caring responsibilities, suddenly that's no longer sustainable. Your capacity for work naturally decreases when you have a dependent, and it's inevitable. I think that has to be modeled from the leadership. I really do. I think this glamorization of kind of working, meeting targets at any cost, growing the business at any cost has to change. Otherwise, the rates of burnout we see are awful. It's a very, very real thing, and it takes employees out for months, and we often see employees leave organizations because of it, and it doesn't need to happen. The more education around early signs of stress and burnout is really important. because ultimately it's no good. You're no good to anybody once you burn out. So that idea of having a high performance culture is great until someone can no longer work and there are long-term sick pay. So employers have to understand that the downside of that. But I do think it really has to be modelled by the leaders. I think that culture of kind of that 24/7 culture is really damaging, and ultimately we just can't sustain it, particularly, like I said, as we kind of grow our responsibilities in life, and some of us will then go on to have families or other dependents, or be caring for elderly relatives. We just have less capacity for work, and those long working days, really high pressure environments, will eventually take its toll on people. So I think as leaders, we have a responsibility to think, how am I modeling that for my team? Am I sending emails at 10, 11 p.m. at night? What's my expectation from them? How am I showing my team that I take time out for my own well-being? I think all of that will be important. And it does in time and over time, I think, give us a better level of productivity. We have to think about it as a marathon, not a sprint. And that takes for us to sometimes pull back when we need to. And that's just as an important part of resilience as kind of that idea of pushing through. So that's what I would say.
Thanks, Mel. I'm gonna allow one more question, okay? And I'll try and do it justice, Emma, whoever Emma is. Any tips for getting the leadership on board with this type of approach? When working with typical baby boomer generations, it's not something they can easily understand.
I'm going to say one thing quickly before I hand over, but there is some great pieces of research now to demonstrate the ROI of these kind of initiatives, which Deloitte carried out a big research study, which they refreshed in 2021, I think, to show that for every £1 you spend on wellbeing initiatives, you get £5 back, and that's in various ways through productivity, retention, reduction in sick pay, absenteeism, presenteeism, all of that. So I think there's some really clear and robust research to actually support the fact that when you invest in this, it's good for the business. It's not just something nice to do for your employees. It actually, you will get more back in the long run, but it has to be a meaningful investment. And I think, like you've said, Emma, it really does have to be supported by the leadership team. But I think pulling some of that research together and building a really good business case for it can really help with that.
Great. Thanks, Mel. So it's obvious to me that just listening to both of you, there's so much detail in here that we haven't covered. I was right. We could easily spend a lot longer on this, and perhaps it makes sense to run a couple of sessions in the new year on specific areas, which we can take offline and discuss. So I think, given that we've run 5 minutes over, I'd just like to extend a huge thank you to you both, Ben and Mel, for your contribution to this panel. And thank you also to the attendees that have listened patiently and contributed with their questions. If anybody would like to follow up with any of us about anything we've discussed this evening, then our details are below. And I think there's a request to call button on screen. But again, I'd just like to say thank you, everybody, for your time, particularly Ben and Mel, and have a great day, great afternoon, great evening. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Appreciate it. All the best.
Thank you. Bye.